Thank you, Fred. All right. Hello, Carl. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this scintillating webinar on what does the reliability of a K out of N system look like. And the reason I actually decided to select this might appear to be a mind-numbingly boring topic for a webinar is that not many people really understand what a K out of N system can actually do for reliability. So if you were to ask someone, well, what's the difference between a K out of N system and a parallel system, they might be able to give you some rudimentary answer about, okay, one system requires more components to work than the other. But what does that actually make reliability look like? Which one would you use to improve warranty reliability, or what, or servicing intervals, or anything else that might be relevant? And if you don't know, then how do you know if a card event system is the right one to use? But I appreciate that some of us might not have ever heard of a card event system. So let's go through and talk about how we can make something more reliable through the use of redundant components. Now, one of the most well-known ways of doing this is to use what's called a parallel system. You can see here we have a two-pump parallel system, which can be modeled by a reliability block diagram, or a fault tree like this one above it, which is based on what's called the AND gate. Now that means that our system fails if component or pump A fails and pump B fails. And each little circle in our fault tree is what we call a basic event, and it represents, in this case, component failure. So the basic event, the circle with letter A in it, represents pump A failing, and the circle with letter B in it represents pump B failing. Now, system will fail only if pump A fails and pump B fails. That's what a parallel system is. It's redundant. One only needs one component for the system to work, which is why we need both of them to fail for the system to fail. And as a little cheat, the easy way to find out the system reliability characteristics for a parallel system is to simply multiply component failure probabilities. But then, of course, this is not the only system we need to deal with. Here is an example of a different sort of system. This is called a series system, and the name comes from the fact that most components appear to be arranged one after another or in series. And you can see here that this system has a pump and a valve. And the system will fail if either of these two components fail. There's no redundancy. And so we can model this or represent the reliability of this system using a fault tree or reliability block diagram. In this case, we have a fault tree with what's called an OR gate. That means our system fails if component A fails or component B fails. And of course, there's a lot more resources on ascendoreliability.com if you want to learn a little bit more about system reliability modeling. But hopefully this is just a little bit of an intro to fault trees. Now, we don't really need to do too much more than that. However, just one little bit of advice: if you need to find series system reliability, all you need to do is multiply component reliability. So for parallel systems, you multiply failure probabilities, and for series systems, you multiply component reliabilities. But then there's another system, which is the inspiration for this webinar, and that is a K out of N system. In this case, we have a 2 out of 3 system. That means our system fails if fewer than 2 out of these 3 pumps are working. So this system only needs 2 of these 3 pumps to work, meaning we have one pump that is redundant. So in a way, it's similar to a parallel system. But that said, we use this logic gate in our fault tree, which is called the K out of N gate. In this case, we can be even more specific, write the letters 2/3 to indicate anyone looking at our fault tree that we only need 2 out of these 3 pumps to work for our system to work. So this might be a system which requires 100 gallons of water to be pumped per minute, where each pump can pump 50 gallons per minute. So we need at least 2 pumps to be able to work. And so that's a fundamental difference between a K out of N system and parallel and series systems. And so if you've never heard of a card out of N system before, congratulations, you are now a master. So that's, in a nutshell, as an introduction, what K out of N systems look like. And just to revise, this system might need 100 gallons per minute to be pumped, and each pump can pump 50 gallons per minute, which means that we have the ability to meet our system requirement if only 2 of these pumps are working. Some people can call this sort of system a particular type of load sharing, where the entire system load is split between more than one component. So in many cases, what some people refer to as a load sharing system is actually a K out of N system. Now, before I get nasty chats and emails and tweets and bomb threats, of course, there are lots of different definitions of what a true load sharing system is. And some of you might say that doesn't include K out of N systems, but many people use the term as if it does. So just to be aware, we can use, well, the term load sharing is sometimes used to represent K out of N systems like this 2 out of 3 pumping system. So if we look at this 2 out of 3 system in a little bit more detail to understand what failure looks like. So failure, the system will fail if less than 2 components have not failed. So if we have one component that has not failed and the other 2 have failed, our system has failed. And because of that, this is called a 2 out of 3 system. Laboring the point because it's very important to get some of these fundamental aspects of K out of N systems and 2 out of 3 systems understood before we talk about some other things as well. So for our 2 out of 3 system, my computer's going to catch up, where we have obviously three components. There are lots of different scenarios for our system to work. You can see here we have 3 pathways where fluid can be moving through 2 functional pumps. Now, a parallel system can look very, very similar to this 2 out of 3 system. At least when I say looks very similar, if you were to walk into a plant, you saw 3 pumps arranged on 3 parallel pipelines. You could reasonably guess that that's a parallel system, and that would only apply if the system only needs one of these 3 pumps to work. So in this case, a parallel system looks very, very similar, but it only needs one of these pumps to work. In fact, parallel system is a 1 out of 3 system. So a parallel system is a special case of a K out of N system. And if we were to look at these 3 pumps, but instead of them being arranged on 3 different pipelines, they are arranged on a single pipeline to create a series system. That means there is only one way for our system to work. All 3 components are working. Actually, a series system is a sneaky form of another version of a K out of N system. This is a 3 out of 3 system. So both series and parallel systems are actually specific instances of K out of N systems. It's just that as a rule, as soon as we use the terms K out of N, what that means or implies to us is that we have a system where, as a rule, more than one component, we need more than one component to work, but we need less than all of those components to work for the system to work. So technically, though, parallel system is a 1 out of N system, and a series system is an N out of N system. So what does that mean for what we are going to be doing moving forward? Well, I'm going to start by reintroducing the old favorites. I'm going to assume they're favorites, my random hands of failure. Now, for people who are veterans of my webinars, you might be remember that I like using these random hands of failures to represent the failure processes of different components. However, I don't know if I've ever used a webinar where I've shown 3 or, well, at least more than 1 random hands of failure, random hands of failure for plural for more than 1, essentially holding each other like this. And you can see here Each random hand of failure is got a little label on it, which helps us understand for which pump each hand is representing. The fact that these hands are holding each other essentially visually represents that these components are working in concert. They're all part of the same system. Now, let's just say these three pumps are part of a sorry, before I got ahead of myself, you can see that each one of these data points which drop from these random hands of failure, we have a red one, a yellow one, and a blue one to represent the times to failure of pump A, pump B, and pump C, perhaps when our system was being being tested. And now we have these three data points representing how long each pump lasted for. And this, if the system is a series system or a 3 out of 3 system, we know that our system fails when the first pump failed. In this case, it happened to be pump B. That red data point is the one that's on the furthest to the left on our time to failure arrow. And so that's what a system failure, sorry, that's when the system fails in this case, because a series system will fail when any component fails or when the first component fails. 3 out of 3 systems, it's when the first component fails. However, if this ceases being a series system, and in fact these pumps are now arranged or a part of a parallel system, which is a 1 out of 3 system, then we only need one pump to work, and so our system actually fails when our last pump has failed, which in this case was represented by this blue. The pump A was the last pump to fail, and its time to fail is represented by this blue data point on the right. And so you can see visually how a parallel system makes things more reliable. And because a parallel system fails when when the last component fails, or a series system fails and the first component fails. So parallel systems which involve redundancy are inherently more reliable than series systems. Okay, so we've got a 1 out of 3 system for a parallel system. We've looked at the 3 out of 3 system for a series system. Then there is a 2 out of 3 system. Now, 2 out of 3 system still has 3 pumps, but you can probably guess when, or you can probably understand or look at this illustration right now and be able to work out or point to where our system failed, which is this yellow dot in the middle. In that case, it was pump C. So pump C was a second pump to fail. It failed after pump B failed, but it failed before pump A failed. It was also, that's at the point when pump C failed, where we ceased to have 2 functional pumps. And so our system failed when pump C failed in between those 2 points. So straight away, what was the title of this webinar? What does the reliability of a K out of N system look like? I actually use the term look in a very deliberate way. I wanted us to actually visualize and see what reliability or what failure looks like for, in this case, K out of N pumps, or K out of N pumping system, or K out of N system. And the first observation is, if you have a bunch of data points representing the times to failure of different components, any K out of N system tends to have system failure sort of more centrally located within all those data points. So if we get our random hands of failure, get the placement of the plural word in that phrase right. If we were to use these hands to represent an incredible number of reliability tests, or an incredible number of amount of field data, we'd be able to see something very, very, very interesting. Now you can see here that the green data point dropped. The green data point now coincides with the time to failure, or the yellow data point, which represents pump C failing. Now, I'm going to come back to that question that Carl has asked in a short period of time, because we're going to go through some really important stuff, and I want you to focus on what you're about to see on your screen when we ask our random hands of failure to show what it looks like if we were to test an incredible number of 2 out of 3 systems. And that means we're going to get lots of data points falling down. In this case, I've removed the colors from the data points representing the times to failure for the pumps. I've added green to the data points representing the time to failure of the system to try and actually just sort of separate between the two. In this case, each pump is identical, so it has the same reliability characteristics. But of course, you can see this sort of dense cloud of data points as you can't see a whole lot of information. So let's add a histogram to help us visualize the times to failure of, I think this is like maybe 10,000, 2 out of 3 pumps that were tested. And of course, we didn't physically test 10,000, 2 out of 3 pumps, but let's just say in a scenario where for whatever reason, we're able to test 10,000, 2 out of 3 pumps, or we had field data for 10,000, 2 out of 3 pumps. This green histogram helps us see the variation in time to failure of our 2 out of 3 pumping system. Now, if we were to compare this histogram to the histogram for our series system, you can see that the green histogram has now moved to the left and is a little bit, for those who missed it, I probably didn't give as good an intro to that animation as I possibly could, so I'll go back. If we move to a series system where the system fails when the first component fails, then you can see that the green histogram is not only to the left, but it's a little bit more spread out as well. And that, again, is both those things are expected because our system fails when our first pump fails, so it's failing earlier. But when you have the middle of anything, it tends to sort of reduce the variation. So when we're looking at extreme values of something, which in this case, an extreme values of time to failure of the first pump, you can see that our green histogram representing time to failure for a series system is to the left. And of course, if we were to look at the same green histogram, but now our series system becomes a parallel system, you'll see that the histogram moves all the way over to the right, because a parallel system is inherently more reliable, involves redundancy, and as you'd expect, our histogram shows that the parallel system time to failure is to the right of the times to failure of the majority of individual pumps. Now, the 2 out of 3 system histogram is right in the middle between those two. And again, now we're starting to see what the reliability of a 2 out of 3 system looks like. Now let's change our perspective, and instead of looking at the histogram and the density of data points, put these data points on a reliability chart, or a chart that represents a percentage of things that have not failed. So you can see that black now, or that line that looks black is actually all those tens of thousands of data points representing pump times to failure, creating what appears to be a smooth line. You can see that green line is actually the reliability curve of the 2 out of 3 system. So the black line represents the reliability curves of our 3 pumps. Now, 3 pumps are identical, so they all go over the top. Now, as a rule, when we have systems with redundancy, the components tend to be identical. Not always, but tend to be identical. So it's not unusual for all 3 components in a system with redundancy to have the same reliability characteristics. Now, one thing you should notice very, very clearly is that our reliability curve for our 2 out of 3 system perhaps is behaving in a way you might not have intuitively expected. At the very start, our 2 out of 3 system reliability curve is higher than the reliability curve of any single pump. But at the end, the reliability curve of our 2 out of 3 system is lower than the reliability curve of any single pump. And we'll talk about why that is very shortly. But before we do, and to help us have that conversation, let's look at the reliability curve for our series system. That green line there represents the reliability curve for our 3-pump series system, where the system fails when the first pump fails. And as you would expect, you can see that the reliability curve for our system is always lower than the reliability curves for our pumps. because our system fails when when the first pump fails. Essentially, a series system just gives your system more ways to fail. A parallel system, on the other hand, gives your system more ways to work. You can see that the reliability curve for our 3-pump parallel system is obviously higher than the reliability curve of our 3 pumps at every single point in time. Now, a 2 out of 3 system is neither one nor the other. A 2 out of 3 system appears to behave like a parallel system early, but then it behaves like a series system towards the end of its life. Now, show of hands. Who is being shown these behaviors, or who are realizing these behaviors for the first time? Anyone? Have a show of hands, from our attendees. Who's for the first time is realizing that 2 out of 3 or K8 system behaves like a parallel system when it's young, but a series system when it's late. So I got a couple of us there. So there's a couple more, but the people who put up their hands are not only learning something new for the first time, but you are also braver than some of your fellow students. That's cool. Not a problem. So I'm going to ask you guys a question, and I invite some people to put their answers in the chat window. As a rule, are we more interested in the reliability of our systems when they are young versus the reliability of our systems when they're old? And when I say young, I'm talking about the reliability of our systems when in the time you'd expect no more than 10% to fail, versus the reliability of our systems when you would expect the last 10% that have been hanging on for dear life finally fail. Which of those two scenarios matter the most? And think about servicing intervals and warranty periods and things like that. Are you more interested in the first 10% of your things failing or the last 10%? Anyone brave enough to hazard a guess? Bert, Michael, love it. First 10%. Love it. As a rule, when 90% of your systems have failed, its service life or useful life has come and gone a long time ago. Fantastic. So even though 2 out of 3 systems and K8 systems behave like series systems late, which are inherently less reliable, that might be okay, because we are mainly interested in the behavior of our system when it is young. And so that's a very key or important takeaway from our observation of K8 systems. But let's look at some more characteristics. So here is the reliability curve of our 2 out of 3 system. You can see the black curve representing the reliability curve of our pumps. You've got the green histogram for the times to failure of our system. Now let's add the histograms for our pump times to failure. So you can see the green histogram is sort of in the middle of that darker set of 3 histograms for our 3 pumps. Now let's just say that for whatever reason, our pumps there's a lot more variation in the times to failure of our pumps for whatever reason, as opposed to pumps tending to fail around a single point in time. They are more spread out, and you can see both histograms have spread out as a result. So our reliability curves are a lot less, have a lot more of a gradual slope. Now, one of the more useful metrics in many decisions that are based on reliability performance is what we call the L10 life. And so what that means is if I was to circle 90% reliability and draw a line across to, in this case, our system reliability curve, that gives me the L10 life. And that's just simply the time by which we expect 10% of our systems to have failed. And sometimes warranty periods and servicing lives can be based on servicing or scheduling your warranty period to coincide when no more than 10% of your things have failed. For different business cases, it might need to be the L5 life, where you expect 5% of your things to fail, or the L3 life, or whatever the right metric is for you. But let's just focus on the L10 life for this little conversation, because because each pump also has its own L10 life. And in this case, the L10 life of each pump, the L10 life of our system, our 2 out of 3 system, is 33.3% longer than the L10 life of our pumps. But if we were to go back to that original case where we had minimal variation in our pump time to failure, all of a sudden, the L10 life for our system is a lot closer to the L10 life of our pump. And so this is another really interesting characteristic as well. And that characteristic is that when we reduce the variation in times to failure, oh, come on, computer. It's doing its own thing. When we reduce the variation in pump time to failure, the things like L10 life also tend to decrease and have less of an effect. Now, my computer is having all sorts of fun gallivanting off in this webinar. It's obviously way more excited than I am about pressing the next buttons. And so what that means is that we now have had a conversation where we have looked at two systems, a parallel system and a 2 out of 3 system, where both of these systems involve redundancy. We know that the 2 out of 3 system and all K out of N systems behave like parallel systems when they are young, and they behave like series systems when they're old. But as many of you students pointed out, in fact, we're actually usually only interested in the early life of our 2 out of 3 system. Now, let's get back on track. Here we go. All right. So when it comes to designing for reliability, for example, one of the many challenges we are facing, sometimes making subsystems more reliable, we often, one of the first things we think of in a very sort of cheap way is to essentially add redundancy. And the first type of redundancy we always think of is the redundancy where we only need one component to work, i.e. a parallel system, which is usually the first type of system that springs to mind when we talk about redundancy. But a 2 out of 3 system or any K out of N system also involves redundancy. So what would make you choose a 2 out of 3 system versus a parallel system or vice versa? Well, let's just say that we are faced with the design challenge of coming up with a pumping system or pumping station that is required to pump 100 gallons of water per minute. Let's just say that's the challenge that faces us. Well, a parallel system needs to have, obviously, 2 pumps, in this case, where each pump is able to, by itself, pump 100 gallons of fluid per minute. A 2 out of 3 system, on the other hand, does not have the same constraints. In fact, we are now able, for our 2 out of 3 system, to use smaller pumps. In this case, each pump is half the size of the pumps used for our parallel system, because each pump only now needs to pump 50 gallons per minute in order to meet the system requirement. So the squares, or the area of the squares behind each pump, represents the capacity of these pumps required to meet the system requirement. And hopefully you can see that the individual pumps in the 2 out of 3 system, their red squares are much smaller. And if we look at the overall pumping capacity of each system, the parallel system, which has 2 pumps, each being able to pump 100 gallons per minute, has a capacity of 200 gallons per minute. Got my sentence structure mixed up. Whereas the 2 out of 3 system on the right-hand side, with each pump only having to pump 50 gallons a minute, only has a 150 gallon per minute capacity. So it has a smaller capacity. However, you might have saved yourself some money because perhaps having 3 smaller pumps is cheaper than having 2 larger pumps. The other thing is that if you have a capacity of 150 gallons per minute, that means that your overall footprint in your plants or in your system is much smaller. So you now have a total pumping capacity of 150 gallons per minute, or 50 gallons per minute less than the total capacity for the parallel system. So you take up less floor space with a 2 out of 3 system. So you want to use CAD event systems to get redundancy, which implies that for CAD event systems, reliability will behave like a parallel system, not exactly like a parallel system, but like a parallel system when your system is young, which tends to be when we're most interested in the system reliability. Oh, and by the way, you can perhaps save money by buying more components, but each component has a smaller capacity, and you can take up less space on your plant floor or within your system. Now you should be starting to see why parallel systems and 2 out of 3 systems should be investigated with a lot more thoroughness and a lot more understanding of what you're trying to achieve. Because each of these two different systems have certain pros and certain cons. Of course, maybe you value the 200 gallons per minute capacity. Maybe you want to have 200 gallons per minute pumping 90% of the time. Maybe that increases the amount of money or throughput in your plant. But at least now you have some numbers you can play around with in order to work out which system might be the right one for you. Now, the other thing too is that CAD event systems can provide you what we call degraded performance. And so that means it might have failed, but it's still able to provide some level of functionality. So for example, let's just say 2 pumps in our 2 out of 3 system fail, which means our system now has failed because it's required to pump 100 gallons per minute. But our last pump that's still working is still happily pumping 50 gallons per minute. So this is an example of degraded performance, even though our system has failed, which might offer some benefit. So when you do your FMEA or FMECA or risk assessment or risk management plan, not all failures are created equal. If your parallel system has failed, what that means is your parallel system can no longer pump any fluid. If your 2 out of 3 system has failed, there's still a chance it might be able to pump at half the required flow rate that's for your system, but at least that's something. And that can be the difference sometimes between an inconvenience and a catastrophe. So here's another little characteristic for your 2 out of 3 system. Now, although this discussion has largely been about what does the reliability of a CAD event system look like, and hopefully you can start to see what it looks like, let's just do a bit of formalism here, and let's look at our 2 out of 3 system. In fact, let's look at not just a 2 out of 3 system, let's look at a K out of N system where we have any possible integer value for Ks and Ns. And I don't always enjoy throwing equations around, but what we're going to do is we're going to go through the equation that you need to perhaps one day use in order to find the reliability of your CAD event system. Because if you're going to choose between a CAD event system and a parallel system, you might need to evaluate its reliability in order to make that case before you rip out a 2 pumping system to replace it with a 2 pump parallel system and replace it with a 2 out of 3 system, which has a smaller footprint and costs less. You just might need to double check the reliability of your CAD event system still meets your plant requirements or your system requirements. So here's a CAD event system. Now, the god-awful equation we need to use to calculate CAD event system reliability is this monstrosity on the screen right now. So let's try and deconstruct this equation just a little bit in order to understand what these alien-like symbols mean. If we look at this equation, one of the first things you might notice is this weird-looking E-shaped letter symbol on the left-hand side. Now, I know some of you know what this symbol is. That is essentially the sister to these to this other symbol we often see in reliability engineering, which is the Greek uppercase letter pi. Now, the uppercase letter pi represents multiplication, And the uppercase letter sigma represents addition. So when you see these two symbols, essentially what all they're doing is they are trying to help us simplify our equations or our expressions that represent something important. So if we're to focus on, in this case, pi for the first, this symbol here tells me that I am multiplying whatever x subscript I represents up until a value of n. So what the hell does that mean? Let's just say I measured the heights of 10 people or 12 people or 3 people. And x subscript 1 represents the height of person number 1, x subscript 2 represents the height of person number 2, so on and so forth. Now let's just say that I'm going to go in the future and measure a group of people, their heights of a group of people, I should say. Now, I'm not entirely sure of how big that group will be, how many people are in it. N represents the size of that group. And essentially, this equation or this expression is short form for multiplying x1 by x2 by x3 all the way up until xn. And as you can imagine, that becomes very useful. For example, when we want to multiply reliabilities, which is very important for series systems, we use that expression there, r subscript I of t, to represent the reliability of the ith component at time t. So R1 of t is a reliability of component 1 at time t. R2 of t is a reliability of component 2 at time t, so on and so forth. And sigma down the bottom, this weird looking E letter, does exactly the same, except for addition. So if instead of multiplying those human heights, I want to add them together, then I can use this symbol over here to represent me adding those human heights together. And when it comes to reliability engineering, we often add times to failure. So one of the more common expressions you'll see is this expression that involves sigma on the left and t subscript I, where t1 is the time to failure of component 1 or system 1, t2 is the time to failure of system 2, so on and so forth. So hopefully that sort of takes the edge off the concerns you might have for that weird symbol on the left-hand side. Now, the next part of this equation that you need to focus on is the fact that underneath that sigma, we have I equals K. Now, that means that when we talked about adding or multiplying human heights, and we said when we add height of person number 1 plus a height of person number 2 plus a height of person 3, so on and so forth. This expression here says we're not starting from the first height or the first component. We're starting from the kth component. So we start when I is equal to k and then continue all the way up until n. So for example, if n was 10 and k was 7, we'd be adding the heights of the 7th person we measured plus the height of the 8th person we measured plus the height of the 9th person we measured plus the height of the 10th person we measured, and ignore the heights of all those people who occurred before the index, in this case, 7 came around, the 7th person we measured. So that's that part of the equation. Then we have these exclamation marks here, which are perhaps accurately capturing some of the emotions you might be feeling out there when you see these god-awful equations. I know that it's how I feel when I see all these symbols. Now, these exclamation marks are what we call factorials, and they make challenging equations look even more challenging. But it's actually a very, very simple concept. So in this case, we would pronounce this expression here n factorial. What does n factorial mean? It just means that n factorial is a product of 1, 2, 3, all the way up to n minus 2, n minus 1, then n. So we just multiply all integer values up until whatever n is. So for example, 3 factorial is 1 by 2, 3 multiplied by 2 multiplied by 1, which is equal to 6. 2 factorial is 2 multiplied by 1, which is equal to 2. 4 factorial is 4 multiplied by 3 multiplied by 2 multiplied by 1, which is 24. And if you need to solve this using Excel, that's the formula you use. Factorial, or FACT for short, followed by whatever n value you're using in brackets. So that's all that's the only thing, sorry, that's what those exclamation marks mean. So let's say we need to understand the reliability of this system, which is a 3 out of 5 system. And we're going to practice using this god-awful equation to find its reliability. Well, let's start from the start. We know that this system has a total of 5 components. So straight away, we can replace the letter N with the number 5, and we only need 3 of these things to work. So you can see K beneath the letter sigma has also been replaced with number 3. And so we are adding these terms where I equals 3, I equals 4, and I equals 5. So let's separate these terms out to get rid of that sigma. And this is what it looks like when we separate those terms out. You can see we're adding these 3 terms together, starting with I equals 3, then I equals 4, and then I equals 5. So all we need to do is, for each expression on the right-hand side with its corresponding value of I, is to substitute in that value. So what this term at the top actually tells us, this is a probability of all 5 components working. You can see 5 factorial multiplied by the reliability of each component multiplied by to the power of 5. Then 1 minus the reliability of the component each component to the power of 5 minus 5. And on the bottom of this fraction, we have 5 factorial multiplied by 5 minus 5 factorial. Now we substitute in I equals 4 for the next equation, which happens to be the probability of 4 components working. And last but not least, in goes I equals 3, because that's a probability of only having 3 components working. And so now we have a way of hopefully breaking down the concerns or the challenges one might ordinarily have for finding the reliability of a K out of N system. So this is all, if you have a 3 out of 5 system or anything like that, this is the only thing, only equation you need to use. Now, the last but not least in this conversation is, that we need to first and foremost have the reliability expressions for each pump, each component. And that is simply the function that gives you the reliability curve of each component. So all this is for nothing if you don't understand the reliability characteristics of your pumps. You need to find those characteristics first. You need to have their reliability curves, not just point estimates, in order to work out or potentially fine-tune whether you're going to use a K out of N system or not. Now, in your guidebook, you'll have this equation and a bunch of others that help summarize the equations you need to use to conduct system reliability analysis for series, parallel, and K out of N systems. And you can see it's not just the reliability, but it's also the failure probability. Now, before I open it for questions, I'm going to go to the 4 questions that Carl has thrown my way. Carl first asks, system redundancies increase the reliability of a piece of machinery or IT systems. So users know in the event of system failure, the redundant system is working in the background to either mirror the primary function or start to kick in after an error has occurred. Any thoughts? The first thought I'll have, Carl, is that by definition, when you say system failure, I believe what you mean is component failure. So that the idea of a component fails, the redundant. Oh, I see what you mean here. So you're using the term system to refer to a component or subsystem. Now, one of the cultural issues that redundancy gives is this false sense of security. The Navy from my home country, Australia, has been guilty of this for decades, where they would put to sea where they would have, for example, systems that are required to have 2 redundant subsystems operational. If only one of those was working, they'd put to sea and wonder why fleet reliability was terrible. So one of the issues with redundancy can be a cultural tendency to downplay risk. We have so this system is a parallel system with two or total of 3 components or 3 subsystems. We only need one of those subsystems to work. Therefore, we don't have to take reliability quite as seriously. If 2 out of those 3 subsystems have failed, sure, we'll still put to sea, or we can delay maintenance, etc., etc., etc. So that's my first thought when it comes to redundancies and how it affects cultures or cultural decision making. Carl then also asks, at its core, redundancy is the duplication of critical components or functions of a system to increase reliability. Concur. It's a safeguard against failures. Concur. But don't mistake redundancy for having a backup. While backups store data or capabilities for recovery after a failure, redundancy ensures no interruption even during a failure. Any thoughts? You are spot on, Carl. I couldn't agree with you anymore. So, for example, I might back up my files on my computer to make sure that in the event of my computer exploding, I can then purchase another computer, download my backed up files, and continue working. But I still have to go through the pain of having to, once my computer has exploded, put out the fire and clean up the mess, then purchase another computer, set it up and download those backed up files. So backups are all about mitigating system failures. The system has certainly failed if you need a backup to be used. That said, backups are obviously very, very important as they're an integral part of disaster and accident management. So I concur with what you're saying. Backups are not redundancy. Redundancy, as you point out, means that the user experiences no failure or no degradation. And you might use redundancy to do that. For example, online synchronization software is a lot closer to redundancy than backups, even though technically that could you're backing up the entire time. So I'll concur with the sentiments of the question. Reliability versus redundancy aren't the same thing. That is correct. So, for example, you might, if you look at planes, I think Fred and I were talking about this in a recent podcast. I think it was ETOPS. Essentially, the FAA said that planes which had fewer than a certain number of engines couldn't be a long distance away from an airport in the case of an emergency landing. And essentially, the more engines the plane had, the further away from emergency landing sites that plane could be. Now, that's kind of a big deal because if you have a 2-engine plane flying across the Pacific Ocean, it can't fly the same route or route as a 4-engine plane because that 2-engine plane has to be closer, according to these regulations, to airports for emergency landing. And the 4-engine plane does. The idea being is that if you have 4 engines, 1 engine failing still leaves you with 3 engines to happily fly the plane. And that's still 75% of your total engine capacity. If you have 2 engines, then if one of those engines fail, you only have 1 engine left. And of course, there's no single engine planes flying across the Pacific anytime soon. But those regulations came out in an era where the 4-engine planes were fundamentally less reliable than today's 2-engine planes. So even though you have planes which are flying those, let's call it more dangerous routes today, which only have 2 engines, they are still more reliable than planes of the planes of yesteryear, which had 4 engines, i.e. more redundancy, because the technology for aircraft engine manufacturing and the quality associated with it has come a long way. So reliability is not the same as redundancy. Reliability is based on redundancy and a whole lot of other things, including component and subsystem reliability. So hopefully that answers your question. Carl also writes, resiliency versus redundancy. What's the difference? Resiliency is a term used to describe the ability for a system to recover from an incident. And that that is different to redundancy. And so resiliency we're seeing some funky ideas of resiliency in universities where you have self-healing materials and things like that. That's resiliency. Resiliency would also include, for example, organizations' disaster management plans, which would include backups. So resiliency would be a function of things like backups and other things, but redundancy is what you have in place to ensure or minimize the likelihood of that disaster or failure from occurring, where you will then, if it does occur, you then need to test your resiliency. So hopefully that answers that question. You can also see, I think Bert has written a comment there. These are good points on the footprints and pricing. How does having one of the two pumps in a parallel system in standby? I'm not entirely sure what the question is. I'm just guessing that you're referring to what we call a switching system. And that's an entirely different webinar. But to talk about what a switching system is, switching system looks a lot like a parallel system or a card event system. The idea is that a parallel system, each component or subsystem or pump starts to age from day one. It starts accumulating damage from day one, or at least in the way we model it. So a parallel system will involve components where it's equally likely for each pump to be pumping fluid from day one. Now, in certain scenarios, if we can somehow nominate one of those two pumps to be the primary pump, and the second of those two pumps to be a standby pump, and then install a switching valve to protect or prevent any fluid from ever touching the secondary pump until the primary pump fails, then what you might be able to do is halt or slow or pause, or whatever the right term is, the aging process for that standby pump. It's essentially kept in mothballs. Nothing touches it. Nothing starts damaging. It doesn't get old until the primary pump fails and the switching valve then transfers the fluid flow to the standby pump. And so switching systems can be inherently way more reliable than other systems should you be able to have components that last a lot longer in standby. One of the things you need to be careful with is that a switching system adds another way your system can fail, i.e. that switching valve. But as a rule, switching valves are relatively simple and they do a pretty good job. And as long as they can detect failure from the primary pump, a lot of the time they're going to successfully switch the fluid flow from the first pump to the standby pump. However, lots of bad decisions have been made by modeling that system without considering the reliability of that switching valve. Now, to complicate things further, it is borderline impossible to model switching systems using equations only. And the reason being is that most pumps or components like pumps are modeled with, at best, bell curves or Weibull distributions that describe how things wear out. And something similar applies for the switching valves. And as soon as you have anything that has a little bit of shape to that curve, you have to use what's called Monte Carlo simulation to then model switching system reliability. That is often scary for a lot of people. And so what do? They make tons of assumptions. They assume you have a perfect switching system. They assume the switch will work perfectly every single time. They assume the standby pump works, will never fail in a standby mode. And the last but not least is they assume both pumps have a constant hazard rate. And when you make those three god-awful assumptions, you can then use an equation to model switching system reliability. But when you use those god-awful assumptions, the reliability curve you get is so far removed from reality that it doesn't give you any useful information. In fact, you might be shocked by the results. But if you do it properly, and that's coincidentally, I'm actually finishing off a lesson for another course, which is how we use Monte Carlo simulation to model switching systems, you can see just how much more reliable a switching system can be, because it exploits the ability to protect a standby component until it needs to be used. So hopefully that comes close to addressing your question/comment, Bert. Greg now writes, should a detailed redundancy calculation account for common cause failures that would affect all components at one time? Absolutely, Greg. That's itself is a subject for another webinar, and I have glossed over it a little bit, but you're 100% right. For those who are unaware, common cause failure is a failure where the cause for a failure of a particular component is shared by the other components, which are ideally held in redundancy. So one example is if you have two pumps right next to each other, and one pump fails explosively and catastrophically with shrapnel flying everywhere, and that shrapnel hits the second pump that's supposed to be providing redundancy, then the failure of one pump immediately negates any benefit of redundancy from having that second pump. That's an example of common cause failure. Very obvious one, but there's a lot more subtle ones as well. So for example, if you are using a brand new pump for your plants, it's replacing pumps from a previous supplier, and your maintenance and installation team isn't quite as familiar with the installation processes for these new pumps. And this doesn't mean they're bad people or they're incompetent, but everyone values experience. If they don't have a lot of experience with these brand new pumps, and they might make the same installation mistake for both those two pumps, which means these pumps fail prematurely, with a common cause was incorrect installation procedures. So it's not just explosive failures; it can also be from things like let's just say immature installation practices. And so common cause failure is a very, very important thing to model. Again, it's subject of an entirely new webinar, but as a rule, around about 10% of failures can be seen or can be assumed to be common cause if you want to have at least a rudimentary incorporation of common cause failure. Common cause failure can be very, very difficult to model. There's lots of dissertations out there from universities where they have slightly or incrementally more useful equations or models for incorporating common cause failure. But it's also very hard for them to be calculated from scratch as well. And so often you need lots of data to try and identify trends or trying to identify, it's called codependencies between huge numbers of data points to get there. So hopefully that answers your question, Greg. Okay. So I think I've got to the end of the webinar. I've got to the end of the open questions. Are there any more questions or comments that anyone would like to make before we call it quits for February? Thank you, Mike. Much appreciated. Maybe let's ask a bit of revision. Does a 2 out of 3 system behave like a parallel system when it's A, young, or B, old? And we remember, when does our 2 out of 3 system behave like a parallel system? Thanks, Sebastian. Much appreciated. Thank you, Bert. Carl, much appreciated. Can anyone remember? Put in the chat window. Thank you, Nasri. Is it like a parallel system when old or young? Oh, everyone's just thanking me and not answering the question. Brent, thank you. It's when it's young. Nice. That said, I've got no problem with you guys thanking me. That makes me feel good as well. But yeah, just try and remember that card event systems behave like parallel systems when they're young, which is 9 times out of 10, the period of their life where we're most interested in. And they have these wonderful additional benefits like being able to reduce the total capacity of your system, which might save you money and footprint in your plant or your system. And that means that a 2 out of 3 system or a 3 out of 4 system or a 3 out of 5 system might be appealing to you and your organization. But of course, to be able to work out if you should use a card event system versus a parallel system or a series system for that matter, you need to have the equations that allow you to calculate CAD event system reliability. And today you've got that. You've also in your notes got the summary of how to compare reliabilities of series parallel and CAD event systems. So you are now armed and dangerous when it comes to selecting the right form of redundancy for your design problems moving forward. Thank you, Michael, Derek, and David. Got 3 more minutes on the allotted window. Just so you know, there is a vicious lightning storm outside my office right now. So if I stop talking very, very soon, it's either because 1, I've been struck by lightning and I am dead, or 2, something else has been struck by lightning and I have no power anymore. Any more questions?
You don't have a backup battery for your system, your office?
Haha, not this one, no.
Redundant power supply?
Exactly. So as a reliability engineer, I am do as I say, not as I do.